Okay, so for this week's tackle tips, I figured I would go over something that, I'm sure there have been people who have done videos on this before, but I figured I'd give my perspective on gear ratio and what that means for fishing. I have a couple of musky reels here, my main musky reels that I use, and then a couple bass reels. The biggest reason that I selected the musky reels is mostly because they're large and easier to see if I hold them up. A couple of things relating to gear ratio to understand right off the get-go is generally your gear ratio is going to consist of three numbers. You can find those in a variety of places. Usually it's going to be on like the handle here, or maybe written underneath on by the handle, or somewhere around the handle, or on the reel itself. So one of the things to remember with gear ratios is it's going to consist of three numbers. So if I pick up my Revo Toro Rocket here, the gear ratio on this is a 7:6:1. Basically, the higher the gear ratio, the higher those numbers are, the more line that you're bringing in per turn of the reel. So for example, with that 7:3:1 gear ratio reel, I'm bringing in 42 inches per turn with this reel. Now, a lot of that is affected by the spool size in relation to the reel. For example, there are some bass reels that have like 8:1 gear ratios that bring in approximately 29 inches of line or 30 inches of line, which is very similar to this 5:3:1 musky reel, bringing in 29.75, 29.75 inches per turn. So one thing to keep in mind too is that you don't always need a bigger gear ratio, and reels are tools, and that gear ratio is going to impact the way that that tool works. When you're using a tool like a lure, the lure is your tool, the gear ratio is affecting that tool, and then like obviously your rod action and choice. But really I'm going to talk more about choice of lure relating to gear ratio in this video. So I'll just start with like my musky reels, and then like get into the bass side of things a little bit with how I choose my own gear ratios and specific purpose for the reels. So if you've never musky fished before, a lot of people musky fish with bucktails. Bucktails create a lot of drag in the water, they create a lot of force, and it takes a lot of effort to reel them in. So something to consider or think about when you are reeling in these lures that are putting off a lot of torque is a reel that has a smaller gear ratio. You're not bringing in as much line. So for example, this Revo Beast I bought with the specific intent of using it as a bucktail lure. Since the gear ratio is only a 4:9:1, it's only bringing in 24 inches per turn, which is approximately about half of what this reel is bringing in. Now, some people will be like, oh, you want the Rocket because it's going to reel those baits in faster, and that might be true for smaller bucktails, but your bigger ones like your 9-10 combos, your double 10s, your 9-10 or your 9/8s, you're going to want something that has less torque. Think of it like riding a bicycle. You're going to reduce your gear as you're going uphill. You're going to be pedaling more and faster to make those revolutions go, but it's not as hard to pedal the bike. Same deal with a musky reel in terms of bringing in those bucktails or hard to pull baits. I even use this reel for a lot of topwaters and some of my swim baits, because even compared to this reel, it's more effective and like efficient on my body to use a reel that doesn't have as much torque for reeling in those baits on top. And this one has a very specific purpose too, but I'll get into that here in a little bit. Now, that being said, again, think of the bicycle example when it comes to the torque that that bait is putting off, and then making that easier on yourself bringing that bait in. It reduces fatigue by an infinite amount and makes fishing and being on the water for longer much easier. Okay, as we kind of work up the ladder, a medium gear ratio here for musky fishing. This is a 531, brings in almost 30 inches of line per turn. Now, I was using this reel for quite some time for my pull baits, some of my plastics, and even some of my top waters and bucktails. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that it works fine for all of those applications, but it is not really perfect for any of them. And that became very apparent to me as I was fishing the last 2 years. I use this reel a ton. I love it. I've caught a lot of fish with this reel. But even though it is very versatile, it does not fit any niche 100% perfect. You can do a lot with it. It works really well for swim baits, some pull pause baits, but I noticed that I was having, when I was doing pull pause baits, that I was having to turn the reel handle, 3 or 4 times to pick up the slack that I'm bringing in with my 8.5 or 9 foot rod. So again, I still use this reel a ton, but not nearly as much as these other two that have very specific applications and purposes. Moving on to my newest musky reel, the Revo Toro Rocket. I love this reel. I know that a lot of people are like, well, Tranks are better, or Tranks or Abu Garcia. I just shop around and I was able to get really good deals as they were clearing out these reels to make room for the new Rockets, new Beasts for the coming year. So I got a good deal on this and I couldn't pass it up. But this brings in 42 inches per turn, makes it absolutely perfect for bringing in the slack that the pull of that bait creates. So like if you're working big rubber, like a bulldog or a Medusa, and you're pulling and then you got to draw up the slack line, where this reel it would take 3 or 4 turns, this reel it takes literally 1 turn or a turn and a half to bring up that slack line. And it is just so much easier to keep in contact with the bait as you're bringing it in through the line, through the rod. And that's where this thing excels, is with the pull pause baits like your Suics, your bobby baits, or your big plastic and your big rubber. The torque of this reel is surprising to me in that I got fatigued even fishing like a Chaos Tackle Poseidon with it for like half a day. And I know someone out there on YouTube is probably gonna be like, you're a sissy, like just cast it out and reel it in. The high gear ratio is gonna bring in the line faster and you're gonna be able to work the bait faster. And it's like, okay, that's fine, I get it. But like, if I'm on the water every day, I don't wanna be fatigued. So I'm gonna go to this reel instead to fight that fatigue rather than just fighting it out. This one has a very specific purpose. I use it a ton, but I'm also not gonna kill myself reeling in bucktails or swim baits or anything that's going to put off resistance in the water, because that is just not what I want to use that reel for. And like I said, some people may have different takes on that, and that's fine. This is just like my own thing. This is what I do. I'm not saying my way is perfect by any means. Obviously, I have adjusted the way that I've musky fished greatly over the last 3 years. So that's basically my rundown of the musky reels that I use. Again, just looking at the gear ratios, I know that there's a Tranks 400 that brings in like 40 inches per turn, which would be very similar to this, and a Tranks like lower gear ratio that similar to the Beast that brings in a similar amount of line. Moving on to bass reels now. I've got a couple reels here that I've retired this year. Unfortunately, this guy is, I think, about I got it my freshman year of college, so this thing would be almost 10 years old. It would be 10 years old this spring, and I'm retiring it this year. I'm having some issues with the gears giving out, so I don't really want that reel to cost me a fish come tournament time. But this is a 641 gear ratio reel. This is a very middle of the road. Anything like a 6.4 or a 6.2, very middle of the road. It's not going to be a high-speed gear ratio reel, but it's not a low-speed reel either. For these 6.4, 6.2 to ones or 6.5 to ones that I really like fishing, I really like throwing spinner baits on it. Again, you're not getting the torque that you would get from a Revo Rocket, or that's like an 811 or a 911 type reel, but at the same time, you're able to bring in that spinnerbait, chatterbait at a pretty good clip. And some people would even argue too that you could drop it down to like a 5-3-1 for some of your spinnerbaits if you're trying to slow roll them, if you're trying to do certain applications. And this is basically my point, is that every application has a different purpose, and depending upon the application or the lure that you're trying to work, the depth range, it's all going to take a different specific type of reel for that specific type of situation, because nothing is ever the same, and that's why it's important to have multiple tools to fit multiple purposes. Okay, so this reel here is a 7-1 gear ratio reel. This is like your original high-speed bass reel. Again, retiring it, this one would be 9 years old this spring, because I bought it a year after this one. You know, when you're in college and you're poor and you can only afford one quality reel per year type deal. So this one is 7-0-1 gear ratio, good high-speed reel for picking up line, picking up slack. Similar to this one, but obviously your bass applications are going to be different. You know, it's going to be something that, you know, maybe you want to throw jigs with it so you can pick up your line faster and then like do a pitch more quickly with that. Another advantage too is in picking up that line faster between these two reels is when that fish is screaming back to the boat at you, it allows you to pick up line as fast as possible to keep tension and not lose that fish. So again, you can throw spinnerbaits, chatterbaits, all that stuff with the higher torque reel. It's not as big of an issue with the bass gear as it is with the musky gear. But at the same time, that torque can wear on you or wear on your wrist over the course of the day. I don't have a 5.3 or lower gear ratio reel here with me right now, but that's going to be like your crankbaits, or maybe if you're trying to slow roll a spinnerbait, slow roll a chatterbait, maybe those fish are a little lethargic. Something to consider too is it's not like you can't throw crankbaits on a 7-1 gear ratio reel. But the thing is, if you're throwing a crankbait on a 7-1 gear ratio reel, you're having to reel that reel more slowly to bring that bait in at a more consistent clip. Because if you're reeling it and you're cranking it real fast, a lot of times what's going to happen is that bait's going to be coming in and you're going to kick it off to the side, and it's going to ruin the way that bait is running. And it's much easier to operate at a consistent reeling at a lower gear ratio rather than trying to crawl that lure with a higher gear ratio. And I hope that makes sense. And that's just, again, going to my main point of fitting the reel and the gear ratio to your specific application. Now, I think that's a pretty brief summary of gear ratio, specific purpose, and intention. If you have any questions about gear ratio, gear that I use, or how I match up gear ratio to specific baits and presentations, please just let me know in the comments. I'll be glad to address any of those as best I can, and if not, I will try and find someone who knows more about it than I do. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'd appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe. If you like the Tackle Talks, please let me know, and I'll catch you in the next one.